So Brian Kelley has his debut studio album out after Florida Georgia Line's temporary disbandment, and what do I think of it? When the Wave Pack was announced earlier this year, I was intrigued to say the least, and the overall reception of the country music community was as well. Brian Kelley wasn't the lead singer of Florida Georgia Line, and his vocals rarely ever got to see the light of day, and when they did, they were for brief moments on songs like Stay or just one verse on Dig Your Roots. Brian didn't get a major role until Sittin' Pretty, a promotional single off Can't Say I Ain't Country. A song for the most part that was pretty mediocre, and Brian's delivery was pretty poor. It was also a song that had a very beachy vibe to it, so getting an entire album of this kind of stuff wasn't exactly an optimistic outlook. But looking into this album, you can definitely tell Brian has potential. There are actually quite a lot of enjoyable tracks on this record. The album opens up with easily my favorite song, Boat Names, and how him and his wife are just enjoying this dock filled with these ships, and how they have these custom traits and boat names, and how Brian eventually wants to put his wife's name on a boat. It's a little corny, but I find its ironic narrative quite enjoyable. However, things begin to take a bit of a dive with Made by the Water, a song that has a very derivative melody, and its writing doesn't really help mask that issue. I will say, the instrumental palette of this track is quite interesting. There is somewhat of a fair amount of variety, much more than the booming styles Joey Moy did with Florida Georgia Line on their first 4 albums. The same can be said for Sunburnt, Barefoot, and In Love. It has some nice fusion of pop instrumentals with this very beachy vibe one could associate with early Zac Brown Band and the output of Kenny Chesney. And then you get to Highway on the Water, which is a track that has a very heavy fiddle accompaniment which really drives this song forward. With this track, it becomes more evident you're not really here for the stories Brian is telling, and more so for the really interesting instrumentation. Afterwards, you get a song that really feels like it was cut from FGL's last album, Life Rolls On, called Good Day, using eerily similar styles of that album with its writing and its audio production. It's a really aimless track that could potentially be on my worst list for 2021. Really, this album is an up-down sequence of quality. When you get a mediocre or bad track, you are usually followed up by a more enjoyable one. In this case, it's Party on the Beach, which really feels like a Midland song done with a summer party tone. Don't Take Much, while pretty enjoyable, feels like it takes major influence from Taylor Swift's Hours off the deluxe version of Speak Now. This very bitter, perky vibe and its very simple yet fun story doesn't really feel like it's ripping it off, but it's more of a homage. Fish All Day is one of the better examples where the writing can have some fun and more variety than a majority of this album, with details like saltwater kisses and key lime pie to sunshine medication and maritime marination. It's stupid of course, but it's stupidity that's actually really smart. The album for the most part holds pretty steady all the way to the end, with any dips being very minor. However, the album doesn't really soar in any qualities after this point. Boat Ride and Beach Cowboy are all pretty basic in all aspects. Both are songs I'm not really keen on revisiting probably ever, especially Beach Cowboy, which has this annoying looped percussion, which is more annoying than a majority of all the snap tracks we've gotten over the years. Its production is very washed up, very messy, and the instrumentals begin to fade, similar to how a lot of the production of Brian's early records were when he was with FGL. And it gets considerably more obvious with Horses on the Beach, which has that booming presence Florida Georgia Line was known for. With all these instruments clouding one another, you kinda lose what makes this album special, or at the very least different from FGL. Sunday Service in the Sand completely loses the whole beach rootsy vibe, opting out for a formulaic pop country song clearly intended for radio, with that party jam clap track driving the entire song apparently forward when in actuality it's what's holding it back. Florida Boy Forever is a pretty poor closer from an instrumental standpoint. However, from a thematic standpoint, I view it as Brian planting a flag saying this is who I am now. And it's surprisingly compelling. I can't really decide on whether or not I enjoy it because of the conflicting aspects of its writing and production. All in all, I think it's a pretty enjoyable album. It's definitely more interesting in its instrumentation, probably the second best I've heard all year. However, where this album soars in its instrumentals, this album sort of tanks in everything else. Brian's delivery for the most part doesn't have a true standout moment where he can really separate himself from the fact he was the harmony of FGL. Dare I say, I was wondering when Tyler Hubbard was going to show up and take the reins. But in the grand scheme of things, there isn't much of a difference between this and really any other mainstream country album with its bargain bin Nashville lyricism. It makes me miss the songs on Can't Say Ain't Country, which had songwriter Hardy co-write a majority of it. And production wise, while I do think it's an improvement over Joey Moy, one of Nashville's worst producers, and was the biggest detriment that made the actually enjoyable FGL songs lack true greatness, the production of this album isn't that much of an improvement, especially in the last chunk of it. Brian used the same team on Life Rolls On, which is hailed as the worst set of music Brian has ever put out. However, Brian has set up a foundation for a potentially really good album. He's clearly got potential in delivery, and the instrumentals are quite enjoyable on this record. If he can get a stronger writing team with possibly Hardy helping him out and a better producer, Brian can potentially step out of the shadow and make an album that surpasses all of his previous work. But as is, I think there are better reinvention albums out there like Magnolia or Kelley. If the album was shorter, I think you could have had a much stronger package. I wasn't expecting this complex album that tackles deep, heavy themes like the best albums do. It's a nice little slice of life album I think a fair amount of people can find enjoyment out of. If you're someone who has always hated Florida Georgia Line, I recommend giving this record a shot. It isn't the greatest thing in the world, but it's a decent alternative to what many argue was the plague on the Nashville industry for the past 10 years. I'm giving Sunshine State of Mind a strong 6 out of 10. It's not in my personal top 10 for the year, but I think it did what it set out to do, which was separate Brian Kelley from FGO and really define him as his own person. And if he wants to be a beach cowboy, who am I to stand in his way?